So there's a series of stages, but the basic idea is this notion of cycling and rapidly flipping through images in your mind. So you can see stage one, basically, he said we called this first stage cycling, which is meant to represent rapid mental imaging. Again, it's belief independent. In fact, he often uses skeptics. So he says, step one, each volunteer is required to make a list of at least 20 things that he or she wants, writes them down. Now notice the details here, because his details are very important. Writes them down without regard to when or how they might be realized. There's no upper limit on the number of items, except that, of course, if you're flipping through these images rapidly, if you try to do it with 2,000 images, good luck remembering them all. So it's really more of a limit in terms of what your own internal capabilities are along those lines. Each item was required to be specific and could involve material things, health issues, and other people. If it involved other people, the other person had to give their consent. Stage two, the items on the list are translated into images. So stage one, you're creating this is step two of stage one still. Step two of stage one, in step one, you created the goals. In step two, you're creating the actual images that go along with it. Again, the details matter. Each item was required to be an end goal. He's not doing a process. He's doing an end goal visualization. So he talks a little bit about some of the things that we've talked about, how people put in they want money, they want to do a visualization if they want money, and he redirects them to what money can buy. Now his health one is very interesting, actually, because he talks about images that are constructed to imply that the health has been restored. So he doesn't talk about seeing sort of the end of a successful surgery. Rather, he talks about seeing yourself free from the limitations of your health condition. He gives an example here of if you have bad knees, but you love to play a sport like maybe tennis, you would visualize yourself playing tennis again, rather than having some sort of specific fix to the knee. He also talks about the fact that when the image becomes realized, in other words, when it happens in reality, you should take it off the list. His next point, each of the images is unique to the individual, and considerable time is usually spent in the construction of each cycling list. That's because you have to be able to recall them. You have to be able to recall them accurately. They have to be the same picture each time. This should remind you a little bit of what we talked about involving Huna and the Ha right and the visualization of the Mercedes in the driveway. It's that type of idea. It's a very specific visualization. And this is certainly something that lends aspects of that Ha right credibility. And finally, he says, there's one exception to people making up their own, and that's when we're doing experiments that involve volunteers. And he says that he had them visualize collectively raising their glasses of champagne to toast success, and that image was to be linked with the idea that the mice had gotten better. So he did have everybody doing the same image, within reason, obviously. If I tell you to make a visualization of everybody collectively toasting glasses of champagne for success, your visualization is going to vary from mine, but relatively the same. Step 3, you got to memorize them. And you got to be able to just recall them in an instant. And I do mean an instant. As we'll see, you need to get to the point where you can cycle through these hundreds to 1,000 or more per second. So when I'm talking about flashes of these images, I really mean very, very quick flashes. So it takes time to get these down. And then flip through them. Now, you don't just flip through them any old time. He pairs it up with emotion. And this is another one of those things where I talked about you'll see things that seem to imply, even in the research, that emotion is some sort of power generator. Now, this is anecdotally talked about a little bit in the public stuff, but here we see it actually used in a sort of a similar way. It can be very much construed like that in Bill's experiments. And so you only run through these images, you only cycle through these images when you're experiencing emotion. He doesn't care at all what emotion it is that you're experiencing. It can be a positive emotion, it can be a negative emotion. It doesn't matter at all. So simply says it's important to cycle through the list as rapidly as possible for as long as emotion is experienced. He says the emotion, but it's basically as long as any emotion is experienced. So as you're going through your day and you notice an experience of emotion coming up in you, you would immediately begin to cycle through. And he wants to get to the point where this is an automatic process for you, where the minute an emotion comes up in you, where the moment an emotion comes up in you, you immediately start cycling. It's just an automatic process for you. Just in the same way that you no longer think about how to drive a car, you no longer think about having to do this. Notice his point here, obviously, his last one on this screen. Obviously, at this rate, there is no dwelling on any particular image, nor is one image considered to be more important than any other. I think we can debate that a little bit, but you can see sort of some of his beliefs coming through regarding this process. So he goes on to say, if practiced successfully, the rapid imaging should not detract or significantly distract from the experience of the emotion. And he goes on to talk about that multitasking ability. And I used learning to drive. He says, for instance, the ability of people to walk and talk and gesture simultaneously without considerable focus on any of those individual tasks. I'm just going to pause here, so if you want to, you can read the rest of it. So stage 2. There is a hands-on healing component to this. We talked about the fact that this was laying on of hands healing of mice. Now, it's actually putting his hands around the cage of the mice, but same idea. And he said, the hands-on healing part was pretty simple. He basically just said, express intent that you have energy flowing out the palms of your hands. So nothing more to it than that. Then stage 3 is sort of the next generation of the image cycling. Once you have some mastery of the image cycling technique, he basically just has you go a lot faster. So as you put them all into sort of one long continuous strip, he calls it a film strip loop. And that's a great visualization, right? Because you can see each picture as a separate frame in the film. And if it's a loop, it's just running continuously. And he just says, volunteers are able to cycle many hundreds of images per second. And again, even up to 1,000 images a second. I mean, just you can imagine how rapidly. So it basically becomes a blur. And he talks about, just before that bolded set of text there, that you're going so fast that the images are a hazy blur. You're not seeing each one distinctly. A little bit more on just exactly what he did. They basically did an hour a day in their initial study until the mice were fully in remission or died. I mean, some did die. And he also talks about the fact that the simple act of doing the hands-on treatment created considerable emotion, particularly at first, and so they would do the cycling, but also throughout the day. This is where he says they would also do it throughout the day in any other emotional situation. So they weren't just sitting there putting their hands around cages and cycling when they felt emotion. It's something that you do all the time. Now, I don't want to imply that this is the end-all method that can be used for absolutely everything and so universally work for people. There are some limits. First of all, a big limit is that no one has ever learned this by reading it. Again, practically nobody knows about this technique. Had I not run into Bill and wound up spending a lot of time talking to him and, having meals with him and stuff, I mean, I probably would have never heard of this technique. So it's buried in publications and journals where you're not as likely to look. Although it has made it into some of the more major journals in more recent years, like the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. But originally it was published more on the fringes, as is a lot of this type of thing. However, it's very rigorous research. I mean, he partners with very, very serious and accomplished lab researchers, other PhDs, with their specialty being bench work and labs. And the research is, really quite solid. So anyway, one limit is the fact that nobody's ever learned this by reading about it. That's not to say you can't play around with it and give it a try. But make sure you get the original article from your library and make sure that you very carefully analyze and don't do anything wrong, because you just constantly find people that do stuff wrong. Now, there's also another experiment that I'm aware of involving Bill and a guy named Casey Blair. Casey is another very interesting, very neat guy. He's spent a lot of time in market research, but he's also done some very, very, very interesting experiments. One of the things that Casey wanted to test was a retrospective test on hospital patients. There's sort of this interesting research paper in the prayer literature that was done by a skeptic, and he actually did it just to sort of prove the ridiculousness of some of the arguments that were made in some of the prayer studies. And unfortunately for him, his experiment wound up showing a statistical significance. Now, we can argue as to whether or not it worked or not, but that meant that basically he was in a situation where he had to, where he's cited constantly now as having sort of proved that retroactive prayer works. You can pray for people in the past and they get better. So anyway, Casey wanted to test this, and he approached Bill, and he said, "Hey, Bill, why don't we do this together, and why don't we use your method?" And Bill felt right away that it was not going to work. And so that's very interesting, because that lets us know that this isn't viewed even by Bill as some sort of panacea method. And in fact, one of their tests was significant and one of their tests wasn't significant. So again, just like everything else, it's contextual, right? The research is contextual. Bill doesn't publish anything. He hasn't queried and published studies on whether or not people put a house in a new car or a new girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever as part of their other 20 images. He's only focused on healing. That's what he cares about, and that's all that he's published on, and that's all that his research is really asked about.